Bon après-midi tout le monde. Je me présente, Maria-Louisa Romano, chargée de projet à l'action culturelle du Musée McCord. Nous sommes très heureux de vous recevoir aujourd'hui pour un 3e thé au McCord de cette année 2017-2018. Cette série offre l'occasion de venir découvrir la richesse des collections du musée dans le cadre de conférences animées par les conservateurs du musée ou des membres de l'équipe de la conservation et de la restauration, et ce, dans une ambiance chaleureuse incluant un service de thé. La conférence d'aujourd'hui, le manteau Red River, un siècle d'histoire, est présentée en anglais par Cynthia Cooper, chef collection et recherche et conservatrice des costumes et textiles. Vous êtes toutefois invités à participer à la période de questions bilingues qui suivra la conférence, donc en français et en anglais. Today, Cynthia Cooper, Head Collections and Research and Curator of Costume and Textile, will tell the story of the Red River coats, those navy wool coats with red piping and hoods, worn with red sashes, toques, and mittens, were once practically the winter uniform of Montreal children. Please note that the lecture will be filmed and will be available on YouTube in the near future. Je céderai tout d'abord la parole à Christian Vachon, conservateur du département peinture, estampes et dessins et chef de la gestion des collections au musée, qui vous présentera Cynthia Cooper. Je souligne que le musée tient à les remercier tous deux de leur présence aujourd'hui et nous remercions également la maison de thé Camellia Sinensis de nous offrir cet après-midi une période de dégustation à la suite de la conférence et l'occasion de poursuivre la discussion tous ensemble autour d'un thé. Alors, je vous souhaite une bonne conférence et j'invite Christian à venir nous rejoindre. Merci.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today. Weather didn't make it easy. But this is what today's lecture is about. Red River coats were once the winter uniform of Montreal children. I am Christian Vachon, Head of Collection Management and Curator of Paintings, Prints, and Drawings. And it's a great pleasure to introduce you to my dear colleague, Cynthia Cooper, Head of Collections and Research and Curator of Costumes and Textile. Cynthia is my dating person here at the McCord. Not that I am dating her, no. But every time I need to date a painted portrait, she is amazing. She will provide me with a very accurate date according to the depicted clothing. She's the best. I've been working for the last 20 years with Cynthia, and let me tell you that when I now look at paintings, I don't see the garments the same way. She taught me that they are true time markers. They are a connection to the past. I am sure you won't look at Red River coats the same way after her lecture. She is one of the best Canadian costume authorities in the country. Please welcome Cynthia Cooper.
Merci beaucoup, Christian. Welcome, everybody. Bon après-midi. And I will begin with my greetings. Thank you for coming out on such a wintry afternoon to learn about a very wintry topic. And I'm going to start by presenting these two of our 5 Red River coats in our collection here at the McCord, and just a little bit about how I got interested in these, but I won't tell you the whole story. I'll save that for afterwards at the question period if we have time. But I started here almost 20 years ago, and I can remember my predecessor telling me, and me scrawling furiously in a notebook saying, if you ever get a Red River coat, that's something we need to get. They're typically Canadian, and we don't have any here at the McCord. So sure enough, about 5 years later, that one came in along with an identical smaller one. And then 10 years later, this one that comes with matching pants came in. And then about 3 years ago, we got 2 more from a private collector. So these are what we have. And it's quite unusual that we wouldn't have more, but I think that says something about just how prevalent they were, how much they were worn, because they all got worn out. So in terms of what is a Red River coat, what makes something a Red River coat, I am going to quote from a little book a memoir of growing up in Montreal in the 1930s by Mary Pete called Girl in a Red River Coat. And she grew up in NDG, which happens to be my neighborhood, and tells a lot of anecdotes about growing up at that time. So she's chosen this coat to emblematize her childhood, and this is what she says about it in the book. As soon as the cold weather set in, my mother got out my Red River coat for me to try on. These coats were the winter costume of Quebec children. They were made of navy blue melton with red flannel lining, red trimmed epaulettes, a narrow red stripe down the side seam, and a navy blue capuchin hood lined with red. With the coat, we wore red woolen leggings, red mitts, and a red sash and tuque, which lent the costume a dashing habitant air. So what's interesting is that she entangles her own social identity as a child growing up in Montreal with a rustic ethnic identity from Quebec's past, habitant, and she aestheticizes it by saying that it's dashing, as if these marginalized people were dashing. And these kinds of nebulous sort of historical and geographical associations seem to consistently accompany vivid recollections of those who wore these coats. I can show you, we have a number of Red River dolls in our collection. In fact, more dolls than coats. And this is the tag that comes with one of them. Winter outfit worn by Canadian children, inspired by that worn by the coureurs de bois of the French regime. So these associations always seem to be there with some kind of nebulous French fur trade past. But the memories of the Red River coat are also often very tactile. And it's interesting, today I noticed when the museum advertised my lecture on Facebook, on both the English and French ads, about 40 people have left comments. And they're all the same memories that I've collected from other oral histories. People remember these red knit mittens that they wore just like this, pulled up over the cuffs of the coat. They remember the smell of the wool when it got wet, as it would today. And they remember these wool knit accessories and the way the snow clung to them in clumps. And so they would be carrying like snowballs on their leggings. And they also remember that it was ubiquitous in school cloakrooms, and in Mary Pete's words, because this outfit was worn by almost every kid in the school, we were always getting our tuques, sashes, and mitts mixed up with someone else's. So these memories seem very potent, and as I say, just with the Facebook post, it was interesting just how many of them came up. So although Mary Pete situates her the fashion for the coat in the 1930s, when her memoir takes place, this coat nearest me is from about 1970. That one's from the 1950s. And in fact, this coat has a much longer history as a child's garment. And from about 1860 to about 1960, in fact, they were even around in the 1980s. And so it's quite unusual that something, in fact, it's even antithetical to a definition of fashion, that something that a garment would stick around for that long. So it's quite unusual, as are its Canadian, particularly Canadian associations. But what's even more, and here are some of the earlier late 19th century versions of what are undoubtedly these coats. But what's even more unusual is that it's based on a much earlier prototype, current in North America since the 17th century, this what you see on the man here. And so this is one of the reasons that I've studied it, both as an iconic childhood fashion specific to Canada, but also for its self-conscious linkages to a culture of the past, and for the particular Canadian national identity symbolism that it carries. And a couple of theoretical concepts have helped me understand what might be going on with this coat. And one is the more critical understanding of the concept of heritage that's come up in the last 5 years. Heritage is not the past, or it's not history. Heritage is defined more recently as an act of remembering that works to create ways that we understand and engage with the present. So heritage may draw from history, but it really is about rewriting rewriting that history for present uses and purposes. And those purposes are often related to nation building, to creating a sense of national belonging, to aligning historical collective memories with dominant ideologies and authorized discourses. So the meanings of heritage change. And there are also recent conceptions of national identity and belonging that look at the way these are embedded in everyday practices, of which, of course, dress is a part. And one of these is banal nationalism, which is not the flag-waving, anthem-singing nationalism, what we think about as nationalism. It's nationalism expressed in such everyday ways that it's totally unreflexive. And the scholars that look at banal nationalism would argue that it's even a stronger, more powerful way of building our national identities. So if I look at this image, I'm arguing that what you see on the right is actually an act of remembering what you see on the left. And in terms of banal nationalism, don't let it slip by you the Eaton's logo at the top with the maple leaf and the store for Young Canada. This is exactly what banal nationalism refers to. So this is what we're going to look at. So I'm going to begin with the prototype of this coat. The prototype coat was actually known as a capot, C-A-P-O-T usually, sometimes a capote with a T. And it was initially a type of greatcoat or outerwear garment, always with a hood. The term comes from the Latin caput, meaning head. And it was worn in Europe from the late 16th century onwards, probably first by French sailors, and then was quickly borrowed by French settlers in North America as a very practical solution to our climate, for which they had little appropriate clothing. And then very early on, it was also traded with indigenous textiles. And the fact that it was often made of blanketing fabrics, and these blankets were also traded with indigenous peoples, has led to its associations of indigeneity, that it's actually, it often has a hybrid, is seen as being sort of a hybrid garment, both French or settler and indigenous, or just indigenous. And so this is an early recollection of a trip to North America from 1686. And you see on the far right a man portaging a canoe wearing a hooded capot. And in fact, by the 18th century, the capot had become common laboring men's and military wear in North America and was particularly favored by rural men and lower level fur trade personnel, especially the voyageurs, as you see in this illustration here from 1730. As I was mentioning, there's a long history of making these from blankets. And while if you look up the history of the blanket coat, the British claim to have invented it in 1812 when their supplies were cut off at Fort Mackinac, and they took their blankets and made capots, but in fact, they have been featured in store inventories in Montreal since the late 17th century. And descriptions of these capots made from blankets always make particular reference to the way the stripes are placed parallel to the hemline, which you see on some of these individuals. In this image by Rindisbacher, you see some with the blanket stripes, the blankets wrapped around them. You see others in capots with the blanket stripes placed parallel to the hemline. And so while the white blanket coats may have had the advantage of offering camouflage in a snowy environment, that's the theory, they weren't the only color. And there's some evidence that, blue and gray were popular, and there's some evidence that a blue broadcloth capot might have cost significantly more than a white one. I think that's what you see in the very lower corner here, one of these the blue variety. So blue and gray capots appear in large quantities in shop inventories to the very end of the 19th century. There was also no one way of making these garments. Broadly, I think there are two distinct approaches to fitting it. And this is an image by Krieghoff in our collection, whose caption is problematic today, and some would also argue that his depictions of indigenous people are also always problematic. But it does show these two distinct approaches. In 1807, Christian Schultz described, who was writing of his observations about North America, and he wrote, "A pair of moccasins and a blanket seems equally common to both," and he was referring to the French and indigenous peoples, "except that the former will cut his into the shape of a coat," the French, whereas the latter always prefers his loose. So these distinctions actually tie into garment-making traditions, European cutting and tailoring, and indigenous use of skins without that much cutting and tailoring. And there are other sources that describe Aboriginal people tearing their blanketing yardage into lengths and making holes for the arms. So here this is actually presumably an indigenous man. He's wearing the fitted variety nonetheless with his snowshoes on his back while the women are wearing just the blanket. And this is one that we have just taken off exhibit from Wearing Our Identity, and this is from Western Canada, and it is a capot made from a blanket, but as you see, there's no fitting in the back. That comes from the tradition of no tailoring that is recognized as particularly indigenous. So I want to talk about a few other capot features that are retained in the children's Red River coat that also have very long histories. And so they're all illustrated in this image. So one of them is welting, which is the insertion of a strip of colored fabric into the seams. And with sometimes a blanket fabric could be quite loosely woven. Welting was a way of reinforcing the seam for strength. So we see that in the later Red River coats. Another tradition that we see in the Red River coat is the closure. We see a button at the top here near the neckline, but these coats are always worn with a sash, often a ceinture fléchée like we see here. And that's what this sash on the children's garment is based on here. And it's part of, the ceinture fléchée is actually part of this whole capot fur trade story, but one that I won't really be going into today. And the third feature that's retained in the Red River coat are the shoulder decorations. And you see them here. They're technically called shoulder wings, and they appear on military garments on the light regiments, which are actually North American regiments first, where there's a lot of cross-cultural exchange between indigenous people and settler populations who are fighting alongside each other. And so these wings are retained on the 19th century version of the capot and seem to be present in all its iterations. So why is the capot named for Red River? It's not unique there. But nonetheless, it's worth looking at what was going on there. And I've put these maps here to show you roughly where the Red River settlement was, where the star is, and the part of Canada that was once Rupert's Land prior to its acquisition by Canada in 1870. So the capot was not unique to Red River, but it developed particular associations there. And in 1812, there were already people living there, but the Earl of Selkirk established a settlement, sometimes known as the Selkirk Settlement or the Red River Settlement. And his settlers were primarily of Scottish origin, but the people living here were of a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds. There were Aboriginal peoples of many different backgrounds. There were English, French, and Scottish people who had worked in the fur trade, and there were their descendants, which had come out of marriages in the fur trade between Indigenous and settler peoples. So it created a very mixed, diverse society, but that began to identify itself as Métis. And out of this in this part of the world, Métis culture began to develop in what are called interactive zones, zones between encounters between European and indigenous people, and it became, they soon developed a distinct Métis style that combined indigenous craft traditions and European materials and goods. So there aren't very many photographic images of Métis people, and I don't think all that many other types of depictions as well, but this is one that exists. So you can see that he's wearing leggings and moccasins, which are probably of Aboriginal manufacture, with the blue capot that is probably typical of the items that were imported from England and that could be purchased at the Hudson's Bay Company posts. And there's evidence to show that these blue capots amongst the Métis, they were most often purchased by the Catholic, predominantly French Métis. And in fact, the English and Scottish Métis tended to integrate back into English and Scottish society. These people sent their kids to be educated in Montreal, whereas the French Métis often tended to be acculturate back into the indigenous groups in the area. So soon these blue capots became sort of an ethnic marker of the French Métis. And this is what you see here in this image by Seaton, this picture of, that he's entitled Winter Traveling in Rupert's Land. What we often see in these images of traveling in this period is that you have an individual wrapped in furs seated in the carryall or other vehicle who is probably in a higher level occupation, and then the person in the lower level occupation is actually stands out much more in the image for their dress and appearance, and in this case is wearing the blue capot. So there are several visitors to the area who would describe the appearance of men of mixed European and indigenous background. One, William Keating, in 1824, wrote, "Their dress is singular, but not deficient in beauty. It's a mixture of the European and Indian habits. All of them have a blue capote with a hood. The capote is secured round their waist by a military sash." Another one, the Earl of Southesk in 1859, described a fellow traveler as dressed in Red River style, a blue cloth capot. And later in the same account, he stated, "They have almost one inevitable type of dress, capots of dark blue. The only relief to this monotony is given by a scarlet, crimson, or variegated scarf around the waist." And then yet another person in this area, Alexander Ross, was talking about the Scots, and he said, "They often imitate the French. The blue capote and red belt, so peculiar to those of French origin in this quarter, have become favorite articles of dress amongst the rising generation." So in other words, he's saying it's almost cross-cultural dressing to him. It's almost sort of a shock to see Scottish people wearing this outfit because it is so typical of the French Métis. So all this being said, there's nothing inherently indigenous about the capot. Britain is manufacturing them, bolstered by the Industrial Revolution. It's shipping them to North America in vast quantities because the colony provides a ready market for Britain's products. Yet nonetheless, and it didn't offer much choice in style or quality or color, but nonetheless, it serves to transform these territories where it's sold by acquiring a status as a cultural identifier, which suggests some indigenous agency, because this symbolic status could only be conferred, really, because they show a particular pride in the wearing. A scholar who's looked at different types of masculinity in particularly in the sporting world refers to this these men in the fur trade as exemplars of what he calls bush masculinity. In other words, they're very strong. They have a lot of endurance for the cold and the winter weather. They portage canoes. They carry heavy packs of fur. And they are admired by men who really espouse a different variety of masculinity, which he calls gentry masculinity. And this is what happens here in this picture. By the second half of the 19th century, it's probably this reputation that follows these Nor'westers who thrive in very harsh environments that lead to men, firstly in Eastern Canada and then throughout the rest of North America, organizing winter sports of snowshoeing and tobogganing, where they take these indigenous technologies and turn them into British sports with clubs and a military sort of structure and rules of fair play. So this bush masculinity is subsumed into gentry masculinity in these snowshoeing clubs, which are first founded in North America in the 1840s. And a scholar who's looked at these has really looked at, these clubs has really looked at the way that they were creating a new Canadian identity for both the performers and the spectators. And my colleague, Beverly Lemire, whose book this research will be a chapter in, has also looked at the way this was actually about Anglo-Saxons sort of asserting themselves as fit to master this rough terrain that was Canada and become a dominant race, which is maybe a much less nice side of the whole thing. But it's through these practices, through these snowshoe clubs and the rich visual culture that surrounded them and tobogganing, that the blanket coat becomes part of the foundational myth of the new nation of Canada. And actually, this week, we're fortunate to have a visitor here to the McCord, Parker McIntosh from Vancouver, who is a historical tailor. And he came here to research the coats that we have in our collection of the type worn by these clubs because he's created his own. And I would like to ask Parker to stand up, and you can just get a sense of the experience of what it would be to see these men in such an outfit. And turn around, just the back. See, look at his welting. See the welting? And the blanket stitching, the way he's put the stripes along the edge. So this is, I can attest, a very authentic reproduction of him. And unfortunately, our weather thwarted his snowshoeing on the mountain this morning. So thank you, Parker. Yeah. So Montreal was at the epicenter of these snowshoeing and then tobogganing clubs. And they became so popular that, in fact, women claimed the blanket coat for themselves. And there's a lot of, they feminized it. They made it longer so it would cover their skirts. And there's a lot of writing about, in both American and British publications about these winter sports in Canada, and they almost all describe the Canadian girl and her particular type of beauty and the gleam in her eye and the roses in her cheeks as she flies down the hill fearlessly, and how pretty she looks with her moccasined feet when she's out in this costume. And in fact, through Christian, I'm very aware of a humor magazine in Canada published in the 19th century called Grip. And in Grip, I found a poem that I think is sort of making fun of the way the British and American magazines write a little bit, perhaps with just a slightly lusty tone, about these Canadian girls. And I can't resist sharing this poem with you. So the word, you'll see they call it a capuchin coat. Well, that relates to the French term for hood, and it's a term I'm going to be discussing a little later on. So the poem is called Suzanne. My girl does not dress, I freely confess, in a cloak of magnificent furs, nor wear a seal sack enshrouding her back. Such luxuries fine are not hers. My fair Canadienne looks far nicer when she comes out in her capuchin coat, made out of a blanket. I say, law be thank it, as up the long incline I tote, the flying toboggan on which she will float, my charming Suzanne in her capuchin coat. Her face looks so blooming as down she comes booming, her hair flying out to the breeze. I sit there behind her, though I've a reminder my both ears are going to freeze. But the sight of her hood is almost as good as a wood fire with heavy back log on, for it warms me inside as I fly down the slide with Suzanne in our airy toboggan. Then after our slide, off homeward we stride. On my back is Suzanne's toboggan. I heed not its weight, while our nice tete-a-tete goes on, while onward keep jogging. Though cold is my nose, tonight I'll propose and see if she'll be my fair bride. I'll say like a man, oh, charming Suzanne, let our lives be one toboggan slide. So you can see why there's a little bit of a touch of mockery of this besotted lover carrying the toboggan, freezing and not minding a bit because he's with a girl in one of these coats. And so as this new self-consciousness emerged about Canada's self-presentation, the blanket coat just seemed to be at the center of it to such an extent that it becomes an allegory for Canada. And we see here one of our own William Notman photographs of a boy in the blanket coat called Young Canada. And here an illustration probably by Henri Julien of girls as Young Canada. So this is the symbolism the blanket coat was developing in the East. But to go back to the Red River Territory for a moment, the coat was beginning to become political. It would become political when Métis identity became political, which was in 1869 and 1870. And what was happening, and I don't have time to do justice to the topic, so I'm going to gloss over it and hope that I explain it correctly, but after Confederation, Canada was eager to acquire Rupert's Land so that the Americans would not. And the Hudson's Bay Company, they underwent negotiation with the HBC to transfer the sovereignty over Rupert's Land, because the HBC, note that I don't say owned it, claimed ownership over it. And all this was done as if the Métis were not already living there. So this is where Louis Riel steps up to the plate, sees what's going on, and establishes a provisional government to negotiate for Métis rights in this transfer of the territory. And Louis Riel makes what is often recognized by historians as a terrible blunder. There are people imprisoned at Fort Garry in relation to this uprising in Red River, and they decide that one of them, Thomas Scott, who is an Ontarian, must be executed. And for people in the rest of Canada or east of Manitoba at this point, there's very little way of knowing what's going on here. There are no telegraph lines. There aren't many photographers, but what there is the illustrated press, because the illustrated press comes into being in Canada just after Confederation. So it has incredible weight in the way its visual culture will influence public opinion in Canada. So this is what appeared on the cover of the Canadian Illustrated News in 1870, the execution of Scott, and where Canadians may have had mixed feelings about what was going on. This image and reports of the incident are what are generally thought to have galvanized public opinion somewhat against the Métis cause. And what's interesting is that in 1870, if I just back up, you don't really see, we know that these people are Métis, but we don't really see any sort of dress identifiers that might identify them that way. But sometime between 1870 and 1874, when this image was made, we see a lot of hooded coats. So the hooded coat, as it becomes a visual Métis identifier, is used to demonize the Métis in public imagery. And in fact, back from Grip, that same caricature magazine, this image of Louis Riel in 1874 shows him in what garment? A dark-colored capot. We recognize it by the wings. And there he is. We see Louis Riel, murderer of Thomas Scott. So that hasn't left anybody's mind. So the fact that this garment is used in caricature shows that it is a recognized visual identifier of both the ethnic origins and political ideologies of the Métis. And there's one other image that suggests this in a very interesting way. As I mentioned, in Rupert's Land, there really were not many photographers. We don't have a lot of portrait photography that comes out of there from that period pre-founding of Manitoba. But this image of Brothers of Louis Riel, taken in they say 1871, I suspect it's 1870, is very interesting because it has all the conventions of portrait photography, and in that, they're wearing fashionable trousers and shirts, but they're wearing these garments which are not fashion, and they're displaying in them, I think, in quite a prominent way. So they're wearing ceinture fléchée, moccasins, and these blue capots. And I think that this portrait is a conscious and staged expression of Métis pride. So by this time, anyway, the capot is disappearing because it's disappearing along with the HBC's hold on the fur and buffalo robe trades in the West. But elsewhere, the coat will live on, miniaturized for children, and named at some point in its future a Red River coat. And it would become a seemingly benign mechanism for the selective remembering and forgetting simultaneously of the Canadian Northwest. So I would say that because this becomes a symbol of Canadian colonial identity, it also becomes a mechanism for the casual erasure of Métis history along with that. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, you saw those blanket coats worn for snowshoeing. Children wore miniature versions of those as outerwear, and there are innumerable sources, both visual and textual, that show us these. But we also know that children were also wearing blue varieties of these coats, and this is some of the evidence. One is this illustration that we have where you see maybe adults, but maybe children, on the slope wearing what are distinctly blue coats with red piping. Lady Dufferin described her children's winter outfits, which can only be these. She said, "You should see them all 5 in blanket coats, which are made of thick blue cloth with red epaulettes and sashes and pointed hoods lined and piped in red. The coats are very long and straight, and the little figures in them look both funny and picturesque." So her amusement captures the irony of the miniaturized adult dress form. And then here from Montreal's Winter Carnival in 1885, a little booklet published for children, again a poem, Mama's Joy and Papa's Pearl. So the poem says, "A little Canadian boy and girl went snowshoeing one day, as Montrealers say, dressed in blanket coats of blue, with capuchons too, scarlet tuques and sashes new, far away." So the coat was around, and you see here, especially when they talk about Montrealers in this, Montreal is really the epicenter of these winter sports. So while we know that this blue coat was around, we don't really know if it was a Red River coat. But we do know that Red River coats are being advertised as of the early 1860s in a Toronto newspaper. Nothing tells us what they are, we just see the name for them. So I have lots of questions. I don't know if they were coats intended for sale to be shipped to Red River that were directed to Toronto because there's a surplus, or if Red River by this time was actually a style that people understood. And in 1860, it's a big mystery, but by the 1870s, when I find more of these ads that just talk about Red River coats, it suggests that given all these recent events in Canada and the claiming of Red River for Canadian territory, it suggests that there's also a claiming of Red River in commercial spheres for Canada. Now, by 1898, we start to see illustrations of the coat in Eaton's catalog, along with the name. Double-breasted Red River style, it says. And so this is when we start to see pictures and know that the name and the form are one and the same thing. And initially we see them for boys only until about 1906 when an ad appears for girls. And Eaton's writes, "We never had them till this season. Now everyone wants them." And they offered 4 different styles in 3 fabrics. So by the late 1910s, girls' coats would come to dominate the advertising, and although there were some ads for coats for boys, they weren't very frequent after that. So the coats were offered in both small and large children's size ranges for children aged 2 to 14. And they were offered by these large, growing Canadian department stores like Eaton's, Robert Simpson's, the Hudson's Bay Company, Henry Morgan and Company, and then in cities across Canada in significant but smaller department stores. Toronto's Simpsons ran the same ad for a boy's coat in St. John and Winnipeg, as well as in Toronto. And Montreal-based Goodwin's in 1911 advertised that it would ship a girl's version of this coat to it wanted every home in Canada to know they could order a girl's version of this coat. And I found ads for the coat by this time in Vancouver and Charlottetown, showing us that it was available across the country. It was not any more expensive than other coats. In fact, maybe it was even a little bit cheaper. It was only in the 1960s that maybe it was a little more expensive. And here you see an ad from Eaton's, 1907, and they describe it not only as characteristic and Canadian, but made in our own workrooms, especially close figuring. So by this first decade of the 20th century, we know that Eaton's and Simpson's were making their own. There are stores that mention them being named for them. Later on, we know we have labels in these 2 coats, so we know that Marquette is one, Little Nugget, which was a children's wear company, is another. And from an oral history, and perhaps these people are here today, Dominion Gator. Are you here? No, okay, anyway, this is someone who had worked for that company told me that they also made Red River coats. So we don't know how many manufacturers there were, but we can assume there were lots. So these ads all have a certain number of things in common. First of all, they all talk about the fabric. And the fabric is usually identified as Mackinaw cloth initially, or Mackinac, then blanket cloth, sometimes Melton cloth, and usually there are always descriptions about how good quality and heavy and warm it is. So here we see they're made from a rich blue-black Mackinac cloth, a thick, soft finished material. The ads always mention the material. The hood seems to be the part that is what makes it the most typical. So they always mention the hood, almost always detachable, sometimes exoticized if they refer to it as a capot or a capuchon or a capuchin, inspired by French designations. And they always mention the lining, gay red flannel linings. The linings are usually always flannel, except to the later, mid-century when sometimes they're cotton jersey, which would be terribly cold. And they're almost invariably red. If they're any good at all, they have this red piping. And it's almost always included in these descriptions of them. So sometimes it's mentioned in the side seams, shoulder seams, and sleeve seams. Here you see it in a sleeve seam down the center of the sleeve. And probably it was omitted in some of the cheaper versions because a Simpsons ad from 1929 says it has 2 different qualities. And the piping is only mentioned in the better quality coat. And this ad says it's fully piped to, as all capuchon coats should be. Now, sometimes there was a blue trim option also offered, but this doesn't seem to have been very popular at all. The epaulettes. For boys, epaulettes are often always mentioned. For girls, they don't really seem to become common through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but I think it's because the fashionable sleeve style then is very full at the top. But as soon as we get into the 20s, girls' coats ads start to mention epaulettes. And you can see it on this little coat here, and that's a close-up detail of this coat. You see how it's edged with, it has a pinked edge, just like that drawing of the man, the indigenous man from Lorette, made exactly the same way, and very similar to the way the wings are made on 19th century blanket coats. So these stick around until about the 1960s, and then they seem to disappear. This coat doesn't have one, and it's probably about 1970. Often the accessories are advertised to go with the coat. Sometimes manufacturers are mentioned, Knit to Fit and Regent Knit, both Montreal companies. And on this close-up of the sash, note the name tag, necessary to distinguish between your coat and your neighbor's coat in the cloakroom. And then these leggings, which people remember so vividly, they remember the pink dye coming out in the snow if you made snow angels. And they remember you would put your shoes on inside them, and then you would put them in your boots, which was more like rubber overshoes. So these accessories could all be purchased separately. And later, we begin to see blue wool pants, like we see on the coat closest to me. We see that actually as of the early 1940s. Smart matching slacks with knitted cuffs and suspenders in the Simpsons ad. And here a mention of the blue option, scarlet or powder blue sash, lining, and trim. Somebody said boys wore the blue. I'm not at all sure about that. So what you might note here is, as I've shown you all these illustrations, even though the features are all the same, the coat is never allowed to look unfashionable. The way it's illustrated, the way the cut, there are all these little variations to keep it up to date so that children will want it, and the ads illustrate up-to-date, children with up-to-date hairstyles and accessories. There's sometimes we see the word regulation, and nobody's quite sure what it means. If they try to describe what's regulation about it, usually it's different things like the length or the hood or the sash or the piping. So this word shows us that maybe there was some concern that there was some adulteration of the original concept, and some manufacturers or stores were trying to entice customers by saying that this was more authentic or more correct. There's also, I use the name Red River coat, but Red River was not the most common designation until about the 1940s. Sometimes we see, as I mentioned before, both Capuchin coats and capuchon coats from the French term. So it exoticizes it a little bit. And I wondered how did people know it was the same coat? Was there confusion? And this ad from Morgan's shows me, yes, they were, even Morgan's itself was confused because they don't know how to advertise them here. They call them capuchon, Red River, or snow coats. Take your pick. So but calling it a capuchon coat kept French-Canadian associations with the coat. Which is sort of interesting. It sort of evoked an exotic appeal to it. And where this is taken maybe to extremes, this Simpsons advertisement in Montreal, even in 1934, says, for play or best, the kiddies love these warm capuchon sets that keep them comfy and looking like sturdy, little habitants. So this is, if you know the poetry of William Henry Drummond, like Little Baptiste, he wrote in dialect verse where he sort of imitated French-Canadian habitant accent. He wrote about these rustic characters. It could be seen as that, but what I see this as something that was quite pervasive in the way English Canadians were speaking of French culture at this time in a very infantilizing way. If this is not infantilization of Quebec culture, I don't know what is. Actually, a garment worn on a child and this statement about looking like little habitants. And then even in Toronto in the 40s, they're referring to it as a popular version of French-Canadian habitant fashion. So there's some anecdotal evidence that suggests maybe it wasn't as popular amongst the French-speaking population, but I found a ton of advertising in the French papers. mostly with the term manteau, Red River, once manteau de la rivière rouge, and Dupuis that calls it a manteau à capuchon. In 1947, I think it's interesting, they start calling it a manteau montagnard. And why would that be? Because who was going to buy a coat that has habitant associations? So they got away from that sort of patronizing English-Canadian depiction of it as a habitant coat by calling it this, montagnard. But I also think that this advertising was what gradually aligned the coat with the values of colonialism and a Canadian identity that sort of conflated this master narrative of the past with consuming a coat and defining it as childhood tradition. And so I looked at this advertising for the intangible qualities that it brings out, that they try to ascribe to this coat, because these are, it doesn't mean that consumers believed it or bought into it, but these are building blocks of inscription of meaning on the product. And I've been showing you all this advertising. I should mention that I think I'm up to 540 ads. It's not exhaustive by any means. I was just looking at how it was advertised in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Ottawa, and then, you know, across the country and in a couple of cases in the US. So this is what I'm drawing from as I look for these meanings. So by the beginning of the 20th century, Eatons and Simpsons were saying that this coat had a quintessentially Canadian character. They were calling it the characteristic Canadian coat for children, or like here, a genuine Canadian garment any patriotic young Canadian will be proud to wear. So this is in Toronto, where imperialist values are running very high around this time, but they're borrowing from that lexicon of imperialism. But it's interesting because it's a department store. It doesn't have to use this, but it's borrowing from that to attribute a sense of Canadian meaning to this coat. At the same time, Eatons and Simpsons both saw themselves actually as agents, as nation builders, really, as agents of modernization by providing people across Canada with their goods and by creating a community of Canadian consumers that everybody could see themselves as part of. So there are also all these linkages to the past that appear almost immediately. Even in 1897, they call it quaint, which means slightly endearing, that the past is sort of a quasi-caricature, diminutive of the past. And you see that word quaint quite a lot. Advertisers belabored these essentializing themes of the Canadian climate and how hardy its youth was, just like the snowshoers in their snowshoe club literature were doing it because they wanted to be like these hardy Northwesters. They borrowed from this and showed children in a snowy landscape or talked about how fit it could make them. So this Eaton's Toronto ad calls it a vivid bit of Canadiana and says it's very picturesque in snowy weather. And at the same time, by calling it Canadiana, they're promoting national belonging through a consumer product. In other words, you can acquire this Canadian belonging for yourself by buying the coat. And maybe my favorite, or favorite would be an odd word, the advertising that I think is the most interesting is that from Winnipeg, because that Red River lifestyle, most of the Métis left Red River, but there were some who stayed there, and these garments were hard-wearing garments. They would have continued to have been worn for decades after Red River became Winnipeg. But there's this conscious distancing of this child's garment from the old garment in their ads. And Eatons in Winnipeg in 1913 said about one coat, they dressed the little chap with all the picturesqueness of the Canadian voyageur. And then here, relic of a picturesque period. Now, this would be probably have been not that long ago on the backs of some men's, and they're calling the period of the Red River period a picturesque period. Another one refers to the coat as typically Western and cozy in the coldest days. And then this one, having forgotten altogether really what it must have been like in Red River, a favorite with schoolgirls since Red River days. So post-war, there's this short burst of popularity of these coats. And at this point, all this imperial rhetoric, this imperialism has fizzled really with the Second World War, that sort of imperial enthusiasm like we saw in the Simpsons ad about the patriotic Canadians, that had really fizzled out. And so we see advertisers eager to broaden the associations of this coat and the way it relates to nation. So they're now positioned as authentic to their earlier forms as much as to their original forms. Like this ad from Ogilvy's in Montreal, like folklore, the dependable reputation of these coats has been passed on from mother to daughter. And there are other qualifiers like a year in, year out favorite, perennially important, and like we see down here, traditionally popular, traditionally warm and smart. And then a coat fashion so good it never goes out of style. So these coats by this time had then become iconic of the symbolic object world of a young Canadian, at least as much as their own past. So something that you had to have to, if you were a young Canadian, to belong to Canada. Now, in 1952, that's pretty much the last year where there's a whole lot of advertising. The coat is really going out of fashion then. And there's a newspaper article published on it called Play Suit with a History. And it shows a very self-reflexive recognition of this coat as worthy of some historical study. And this is the photograph that appeared with it. And so it describes it as an authentic Canadian costume worn during most of the 19th century by whites and Indians, early settlers in Quebec, Manitoba, and the Northwest. And I think this attribution alludes to a historical myth that had become prominent by this time, which is that of peaceful partnership in the founding of Canada. Red River as an uprising had never happened in this explanation. This was everybody coming together, and it showed just what how the coat could encapsulate that vision of Canada. It's a garment born of the fur trade that acknowledges the place of Red River in uniting East and West, French and English and Indigenous and settler peoples. A manufacturer who made the coat until the 60s attributed the disappearance to the embracing of modern technology because few children wanted to wear wool coats when they could have ski jackets of waterproof fabrics and then snowmobile suits in the 70s. And so by 1966, this whole Renfrew ad calling it Canadiana for young collectors implied that it was a nostalgic revival of a consumer product of a traditional childhood. And this outfit came from Holt Renfrew, but it's probably even a little later. And another former buyer for the Hudson's Bay Company recalled carrying them into the 1980s for grandmothers who felt that their granddaughter's childhood would not be complete without one. So it's this shared history of national belonging through consumption at that stage. So as I begin to wrap up, I think it's important to raise questions about how, if advertisers attributed all these meanings to the coat, how are they actually understood or consumed by consumers? And particularly, these consumers are children. They're not even adults. And it's always problematic to look at consumer intent. But we have to also ask ourselves how these messages were received over time, because this is quite a long period of time. So during this period where they were popular, we had an ever-increasing and globalizing culture of consumption. We had the modernization of Canada, the commoditization of childhood, a recognition of the possible incursions of American cultural domination in Canada, and a desire to embrace Canadian symbols as a sort of protection against that. But it's difficult to examine consumer motivation. Consumers' motives can be described as a jostle of conscious reasons and unconscious forces. And so with children, it's just that much harder to pin down. And a little bit of work has been done on this garment, which has something in common with the Red River coat. It's a sailor suit. And the sailor suit has had sort of a similar trajectory. It is a garment that came out of a martial occupation that sustained the empire in colonial contest. It was just on different terrain. Instead of being in the snow, it was at sea. And it has been kept fashionable, miniaturized, and there's been an ongoing reinvention and reinterpretation of its vocabulary over the 19th and 20th centuries. So a scholar who's looked at this says, well, these were just practical. As the more they became practical, the more there was a distancing of what they actually meant till it was actually forgotten. But I would argue that undeniably, with the Red River coat, there are acts of remembering. Missy Tatlow's coat remembers the Métis voyageur's coat. The Simpsons coat from the 1940s remembers Missy Tatlow's coat, and the coat from the 60s remembers the one from the 40s. And so there's an undeniable act of remembering going on that is a visual reminder of some core myths of a glorified past, and it's projecting it onto children's bodies in a form that's both diminutive and infantilized. The Red River coat was predicated on reminders of people who bore witness to a fitness for a rough lifestyle in a challenging climate. And in the name Red River, there was a form of representation which is indissociable from the Métis community that was brought under control by settler colonial powers in the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. So I think if heritage is defined as gestures that collectively reshape and rewrite history to serve dominant ideologies, that retaining this miniature version of the coat has to be an example of this phenomenon materialized. And it's insidious because it integrates Red River into a colonial identity project, but at the levels of department store advertising, consuming and wearing, and eventually remembering one's own childhood. And I think these acts are a good example of this form of banal nationalism. It's very unreflexive, but it makes it a powerful force in shaping national identities. And in this way, I think that this winter garment, although practical as it may have been, cute as it may have been, was given agency to do the work of heritage. When Mary Pete, coming back to Mary Pete, her story about the coat, she says, she describes, after describing it as the quote that I gave at the beginning, she tried it on and it didn't fit anymore. So when her mother asked her if she would like something different, and Mary Pete's reply was, "What an odd question." So they went to Eaton's and they returned with an identical one. It was a choice, both their choices. And so she's revealing, by saying, what an odd question, she reveals the depths of her assumptions about how appropriate this coat is to her everyday life experience. And like Pete and her mother, generations of Canadian parents and children favored this form time and time again, whether or not they knew quite why. And in doing so, they encouraged mass retail, its factories, suppliers, the rhetoric of its advertisers, and department stores which promoted their own role as agents of modernizing Canada, perpetuated its alignment with unifying discourses about a particular Canadian history, tradition, and character. So I think that even if children wearing the coat were hardly complicit, they were carrying this informal social knowledge of the coat as imperial livery to a broad audience. From an historical, unofficial, quasi-uniform, a uniform created apparently by choice by the Métis from goods made available to them from colonizers, settler Canadians reappropriated the Red River coat and made it a uniform by choice of Canadian childhood and particularly girlhood. The Red River coat served to remember the fur trade society of the Northwest by erasing discordant Métis and rewriting their French and Indigenous character as constitutive of a Canadian colonial identity. So this cute little coat with its red piping and sash and pointed hood worked to eventually create this nation-building narrative and one of belonging to Canada with the progress offered by consumption and then the sentimentality of traditions of childhood. So as for a full century, as children with those matted red mittens made snowballs and the tassels bobbed on these, from the strings on these red tuques, children embodied and performed the heritage of the Canadian colonial master narrative. Thank you.